Alright, so we're going to go through what I think is probably the most important video of the course, um, where we look at the pharaohs of the Exodus, right? Now, if you'll notice, I have that in plural, right? Because a lot of times we think, who was the pharaoh of the Exodus, right? You know, who was the pharaoh during the time of Egypt, and typically what people mean by that is who was the one that drowned in the Red Sea, you know. But to understand the whole story, we want to look at, actually we're going to look at 7 or 8 or so pharaohs. We'll just go through them somewhat quickly and just kind of discuss a little bit about each one, because from the time of Joseph all the way up until the time of Moses, we're in, and I'll show this to you throughout the course of this video, what is the 12th Egyptian dynasty, right? The 12th Egyptian dynasty, and you won't find this in probably hardly any Egyptian sources, or even most biblical scholars don't have this part correct. And so what you're going to get today is a really good lesson, because one of the main reasons that so many of the Egyptian scholars and biblical scholars keep missing this is because of the dating, right? And so we'll do a different lesson on the dating system in this course, but suffice it to say that the main thing that they use to date Egyptian dynasties, were the celestial kind of occurrences, solar eclipse, times when stars were in certain alignments, things like that. Rare solar events can be used then to date something. So if we have a pyramid where they etched in, on such and such, of their dates, this, solar eclipse happened. So if you know the general time period of when that pyramid was built, then you can go back in and see in that time frame that you think, within 100 or 200 years, you can probably pretty much guesstimate, and then there's probably only one in that 200-year period, and then you can look at that and say, oh, so that was this date here, and then they work their way out from there, trying to date everything else. But the trouble is, if you have that first general period wrong, then some of the celestial dates that you get will not always be correct, right? And so that's kind of what we've got here with some of the Egyptian history, because one of the things that the early dating systems that were used for Egyptian scholars didn't take into account was the fact that many of these Egyptian dynasties ran concurrently. So they ran at the same time. And so basically what they did was they found a date that they knew to be accurate, or they thought they knew to be accurate, by looking at these dynasties, and then started counting them off from there. But the trouble is, many of these dynasties were concurrent, which means they were at the same time. So for instance, the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th dynasties all reigned at the same time. And so if you're trying to figure out, when a biblical event happened, and you think that 16, 15, 14, and 13 all were back to back to back, right, in one long linear reign, then the date that you get for the 12th dynasty is going to be a lot different than if you understand that the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th all ran at the same time. It cuts, several hundred years off of the dating. And so if you ask Egyptian scholars, they'll tell you, oh, our dates are they can't be wrong, they're unalterable, proven through celestial occurrences. But what they won't tell you is that is the 9th unalterable date that they have selected in the last 50 years, right? As far as their dating scale, Egyptian scholars have changed their dates about 9 times in the last 50 years. But every one of the 9 times they came out with the declaration that it was unalterable, couldn't be wrong, absolutely verified. So it just goes to show you it's not as verified as they think it is, and it's open to in some interpretation, because if they don't get the right celestial occurrences figured out, then where they extrapolate out from that is wrong. And so there's some good Christian research. I won't say a lot of it. There's really not. There's only a few people that from a Christian standpoint have gone back in and challenged these Egyptian dates, because what it leads to is you get all of these Christians who watch TV shows where they say, oh well, Joshua rather took down Jericho, couldn't have taken down Jericho because Jericho was destroyed, albeit in the way the Bible says, but it was about 200 years to 300 years earlier than what the Bible says. It was already destroyed when Joshua got there. But if you take into account their mistakes, which throw off their dating by about 300 years, then all of a sudden Joseph's, the account from the Bible and the date the Bible says it happened, lines up perfectly then with the Egyptian dating and what they found at the site of Jericho. The trouble is, the Egyptian archaeology is so pronounced and so profound in the world, like as far as many archaeologists, particularly in Middle Eastern archaeology. Egypt is kind of like the head and shoulders above everybody else, and so everybody dates their findings off of Egyptian findings, because there's just so much that has been found. The Egyptians did a really good job of preserving things, and so everybody else's dating system really links back to the Egyptian one. So if the Egyptian one's wrong, then it throws off a lot of things, and so that's why we get so many of these apparent discrepancies when we're trying to define biblical archaeology, and it's not really discrepancies. I mean, the Bible is correct, and the archaeology is correct. The trouble is the Egyptian scholars are just all over the place with their dating system, and because everybody takes what they say as unalterable truth because they tell you it is, then the only conclusion is, well, if the Egyptian one is unalterable, I guess these Bible guys just started, I guess they're just wrong. The Bible is not true, I guess, even though these Egyptian scholars have used 9 different dating systems in the last 50 years. So, basically, the reason I throw all that out at the beginning, without giving a detailed explanation of that, is just to lay the foundation of why this particular lesson is not taught in more places, right? Because, well-meaning Christian scholars, they go back in and look and they say, well, they don't know anything about Egyptian timetables, so they're just going by what the Egyptian scholars tell us, and so they look at what the Bible says the date was, because we know what date the Bible says it happened. The Bible says it happened in 1446. We know that because of the date of, it tells us how many days from the Exodus it was until the Temple of Solomon was built, and we know when Solomon's temple was built. We have that date very rock solid, which means then we have the Exodus date rock solid. It was 1446 BC. But then where it all begins to unravel is if you look at 1446 BC according to the Egyptian scholars, none of what they say happened in 1446 lines up with what the Bible is saying happened in 1446. And so, like I said, the trouble comes down to the fact that their dating system is all screwed up. And if you adjust their dating system about 300 years, which is what they're off by, when you add up all of their mistakes, it totals about 300 years for the relevant biblical period that we're talking about. If you adjust for that 300 years, and then compare what, the Bible says 1446, and then compare the adjusted and corrected Egyptian dates for what should be going on in Egypt in 1446, then you stumble upon the 12th dynasty. And the 12th dynasty is the one that fits exactly perfect everything that the Bible says. And so the 12th dynasty is what we're going to look at today. The 12th dynasty begins right around the time Joseph is thrown into prison, sold into slavery by his brothers. Right? So that's right around the time period that the 12th dynasty begins. The 12th dynasty ends just a couple years after Pharaoh's drowned in the Red Sea. Okay, so everything, we'll talk about that in a minute, but everything fell apart. After, I mean, think about it, his army drowned in the Red Sea. And Pharaoh drowned. All of his officials drowned. Everybody, the whole army is drowned. It was chaos in Egypt after that. And so the 12th dynasty only lasted 3 or 4 years after that, and then it all fell apart. And then other people came in, and it was basically divvied up, right? And so after the 12th dynasty, so it starts with 1, right? So 13 would have been the one that came after then the 12th. And so what we'll talk about then is in that chaos and anarchy, the massive 12th dynasty was basically divvied up. Different groups rushed in after the biblical collapse there, after the collapse that the Bible records with Pharaoh's army drowning in the Red Sea. And so that's why you get 4 dynasties going concurrently after this. All right, so we'll talk about that in a minute. And so it begins with Joseph. So that's where we're going to start our story. And telling, in this lesson, I want to just tell the story, if I can, of what we know and what happened and how Egyptian archaeology, what we know about the 12th dynasty, how that confirms everything that the Bible teaches, right? Okay, and so after this lesson, you'll have a pretty good understanding then about how some of this stuff unfolded, right? So to begin with, we'll start. That's not a typo at the top. That is his name, right? So there's only 2 names, although there's 7 or 8 pharaohs. So there's Amenemhet and then Sostres. And so there'll be Amenemhet 1, there's an Amenemhet 2, an Amenemhet 3, and an Amenemhet 4. There's a Sostres 1, 2, and 3. And they go back and forth with those different names. So they kept naming them after, dad and son and everything. So those are the only 2 names you need to know. But they are different people. So Amenemhet 1, Amenemhet 2, Amenemhet 3, Sostres 1, 2, and 3, Amenemhet 4. We're going to explain each of them, right? So the challenge is to remember which one did what, right? Okay. So Amenemhet 1, this is the pharaoh who started the 12th dynasty. In Egyptian political theory, I guess you could say, they would always have, it was fairly standard, almost like in the United States we have a president and a vice president, chief of staff, different positions that were common, right? Well, in Egypt, the position of number 2 over the whole land, the position that Joseph, incidentally, was promoted into, is actually a very common and normal position in Egypt. Right, so Joseph was not, the pharaoh that promoted Joseph did not just create some position out of thin air, and Joseph was the only one to ever occupy to be number 2 over the whole land, with the exception of Pharaoh only. That was a standard position through most of the Egyptian dynasties. So Joseph, it would be like as if the President of the United States appointed Joseph to be, vice president. Right, basically something like that, and it is not that he was the first vice president. There's been a vice president of every presidency just about in the United States, so he wasn't the first one. But because he's the only one that the Bible really talks about, if you don't know Egyptian history, then you would think that Joseph was unique in that role, but it wasn't. It was a standard role. What was unique was that Joseph was not an Egyptian. That was the unique part. And it was also not unique that Pharaoh appointed him. That was standard. It's not like in our democracy where you have to vote one of these people in. It was when Pharaoh decided he wanted you to do it, then it was instant. From the day he said, all right, you're the one, from that day forward, your life was totally different because you were instantly in that spot, like Joseph's life, right? And so to begin the story, we start actually in the 11th dynasty. And the name of that position, by the way, is Vizier. V-I-Z-I-E-R. V-I-Z-I-E-R. Vizier. That was the number 2 position in Egypt. So Pharaoh was number 1. Vizier was number 2. And so the 11th dynasty had a vizier who was the 11th dynasty's pharaoh. His vizier, his number 2, was a man by the name of Amenemhet I. And then one day he rebelled against his pharaoh, killed his pharaoh, and took over all of Egypt, and then thus ended the 11th dynasty. And when he took over the throne after killing the other pharaoh, it began the 12th dynasty, right? Because he was not related to him. So that family line ended when he killed that pharaoh and his family and took over the throne. Amenemhet I then started this 12th dynasty, right? And so that's where we pick up the story here, is that Amenemhet I has just recently taken over Egypt, right? And so now we have the beginning of the 12th dynasty. And this happens right around the time that Joseph is being sold into slavery by his brothers. And so one of the interesting things that Amenemhet I did when he first took over is he moved the capital from southern Egypt up to northern Egypt. And that's interesting because it helps to verify the dating, because clearly from the biblical story the capital is there in northern Egypt, right, where all this stuff from the Bible takes place in northern Egypt, right on the border between where farmers and shepherds would be coming in from the promised land. The capital was right there in northern Egypt. So where the Israelites were enslaved, all that stuff, that's northern Egypt. But for the majority of Egypt's history, the capital was not in northern Egypt. The capital was in southern Egypt, closer down towards Ethiopia on that end of Egypt. And so this pharaoh decided, hey, let's move it up to the northern part. Perhaps he wanted to be closer to the Nile Delta. There's a lot of farmland there in the northern part. For whatever reason, he decided to move the capital to the north. And all of the Bible story takes place there. And so this is one of the few pharaohs one of the few dynasties, rather, throughout all of Egyptian history where it even makes sense for it to be the biblical story, because it has to be the dynasty of the biblical story. The pharaoh is clearly, his capital is right there. Because the Bible says he was right near where the Israelites were enslaved. Moses would walk to Pharaoh's house during the end there when they were doing the plagues. Moses was floated in the water, and Pharaoh's daughter was right there, just down the stream, which makes sense because when Joseph was exalted to vizier, they gave the Israelites the best of the land, which means they put them right near Pharaoh's house, right? Which is, all of this takes place in northern Egypt, right? And so that's one of the first interesting things, is that really fits the biblical description and helps us to understand a little bit, because if you didn't know Egyptian history, you might just assume it was always there, but it wasn't. The capital became the capital in the north only here in this 12th dynasty, right? And so that's right about the time that the Bible starts talking about this, right? Okay, so there were some other dynasties that had it in the north as well, but the majority of Egyptian history, the capital is in the south. All right, so Amenemhet I starts the 12th dynasty, right? And Joseph at this time is just a slave, right? And Amenemhet I reigns for several years. I want to say about 12 years or so. Amenemhet reigns. So almost all of the time that Joseph is in prison, right? Amenemhet I is reigning. Everything's going fine. He's got the typical things that a pharaoh has. He's got a bodyguard, and the chief of his bodyguard was in charge of protecting him. So what we're not sure is if Potiphar was Amenemhet I's bodyguard, or if Potiphar came a little bit later on the scene. We're not entirely sure. It's possible that Potiphar was this pharaoh's chief bodyguard, right? And so that's a possibility. It's a strong possibility. And so Joseph is in slavery, right? And Amenemhat one night, while he's sleeping, men rush into his room and try to kill him. And so Amenemhat I is laying there in bed. Took him a while to get a sword. He was wounded severely. They thought he was going to die. He thought he was going to die too. Some of his bodyguard turned against him. Some of his bodyguard supported him, right? And so those that were not against him ended up eventually winning and driving out those that were trying to kill him. Basically, what they were trying to do to him is what he did to the Pharaoh of the 11th dynasty. They were trying to come in and kill him so that they could take over. And it's interesting that Amenemhat I, we have documents from his dynasty that talk about his vizier, his number 2 in charge. And so we know he had one. But then if you go to his pyramid where they're all buried, you have Amenemhat I, and then the next tomb for his most favored official is his number 3. And then it goes to number 4 and so on. There is no tomb for Amenemhat I's vizier, even though we know from other documents that he had one. And so it's very strange that his number 2 person would not be found anywhere there in his pyramid, but the number 3 person is, and it skips right over number 2. What we believe is that it then most likely would have been his vizier who led the attempted assassination, right, in the middle of the night. And so the vizier was probably killed, and that's why he has no tomb, because Pharaoh, because the vizier would have been the one to take over. So he's the most likely suspect, because anybody other than him, if they killed the Pharaoh, then the vizier becomes Pharaoh and not who did the assassination. So the only one that it really makes sense to do an assassination is if you're the number 2 guy, because then you get promoted. And if it had been somebody else, you would have expected to have found the number 2 guy's tomb right alongside Pharaoh, and he wasn't. And so the interesting thing here is that the people that attacked Amenemhat I were people that were very close to him. And the reason that we know that is because Amenemhat I has a son named Sostres I. All right, so Amenemhat I is Pharaoh, but his son Sostres I is old enough to lead the fighting men. Right, he's not a young boy. He's old enough to be general, and he's out with the army fighting battles wherever. Right, and so he's got the army fighting, I believe, against the Libyans at the time, and so he's got the Egyptian army out in battle. Which is another reason probably why these people tried to do the assassination right then, because the army wasn't in town, right? And so Amenemhat I, believing that he's about to die because he was wounded pretty badly in the attack, writes a letter to his son, who is the general, Sostres I, who's got the army, saying, "Rush back. We need you to come back." Not so much to get the army back, but because he was worried that if he died before Sostres I got back, somebody else might try and take the throne, right? And so he wanted Sostres to hurry up and come back, and he would pronounce him the new pharaoh, and then that way if Amenemhat I died, it wouldn't matter, and if Amenemhat I still lives, then they just reign together as a father and son. But he needed to make sure that publicly Sostres I was declared pharaoh also, so that if he died, his son would easily take the throne. And so Sostres I rushes back with the army and everything, and they come back in, and Amenemhat I, who thought he was going to die, actually didn't die. He actually lived another 10 years. But they went ahead and made Sostres, his son, pharaoh also. So really kind of at that point, Sostres I takes over. Amenemhat I is wounded, so he's kind of out of the public image from that point on. You could say almost like retired from that point forward. And Sostres I pretty much takes over, and his dad just kind of relaxes. who knows the extent, maybe he had a limp or he was disfigured in some way, whatever it is, he was somewhat out of the limelight from that point forward, but he didn't die. He stayed alive for another 10 years. And so the interesting thing is that during this time, he tells his son, right, in the letter, right? So we have the letter, actually, that Amenemhat I wrote to Sostres I, urging him to come back. And so in the letter, he says that Amenemhat I says, the people that were closest to me turned against me in revolt. People in my own house tried to have me killed. All right? And he says to his son, don't trust anyone. Rush back, don't trust anyone. It was the people that were closest to me that tried to have me killed. Coincidentally, once you adjust for the 300 years and you get the dating system right, this coincides with the year that the butler and the baker were thrown into prison. The Bible never tells us why, but it appears, when you put the timeline together, that Amenemhat I suspected that one of them, or both, was involved in the conspiracy, right? And he wasn't sure, so he threw them both in prison. Later, we know with Joseph's dream that they find out that one of them was guilty and one of them was innocent, and so they kill the one, let the other one go, right? But clearly he wasn't sure who did it. He says, somebody in my house has betrayed me, someone very close to me, is what he says to his son Sostres in the letter. And right at that same time, the butler and the baker are thrown into prison, and that's where Joseph enters the story. And so the other thing that we know is that Amenemhat I then, as Sostres takes over as the new pharaoh, Sostres returns, takes over as the new pharaoh, Amenemhat says to him, don't take a vizier. Don't even have one. They're just going to try and kill you and take over, because his vizier has just tried to, kill him. And when he was vizier, Amenemhat I, when he was vizier in the 11th dynasty, he killed that pharaoh and took over all of Egypt. So Amenemhat I says to his son, you know what? It's better if you don't even have a vizier. Don't make somebody number 2 over the whole kingdom. And so for the next 3 years, Sostres I had no vizier. There was nobody that was in that number 2 position over all of Egypt, until Joseph is given the dream, the interpretation of the dream. And if you remember the story, Sostres I, in the middle of the night, has a dream with 7 cows that eat the other 7 cows, and he has a dream of 7 heads of grain that eat the other 7 heads of grain, and he can't figure out what it is, and so he's reminded then of Joseph, right? And he's told about how Joseph interpreted a dream, and so he brings Joseph in. Joseph interprets the dream, and he says, hey, who better to have as a vizier than this guy? He's godly. He's got the Spirit of the Lord in him. He's a man of integrity. If I'm going to have somebody in the number 2 position, hey, who better than this guy? I can trust him. And so he promotes Joseph and puts him in the vizier spot that had been empty for several years because of the betrayal that his father had experienced with his number 2. Sostres just didn't have one until Joseph comes along, and I believe God was holding that spot for Joseph, and right then the Pharaoh says, "Hey, who else are we going to find that would be a good vizier except for this guy? He's godly. We can trust him. Let's put him there, and that way we don't have to worry about it, right?" And so there thus begins the story of Joseph under the reign of Sostres I, right? And so Sostres I is reigning. Joseph has been exalted. And so there's some interesting things that we know from Egyptian history when we line this up and begin to realize that it is the 12th dynasty that is the biblical one that corresponds with all of the story from Joseph to Moses, right? That this Sostres I, we know from history that his vizier, although it doesn't call him Joseph, it does talk about what his vizier did. And his vizier was put in charge of we know that they had this giant grain collection, right, which is exactly what the Bible says. But many of the pyramids from Sosthenes I's time, the ones that he built, and the ones that were in the cities during his reign, have hieroglyphics on them on the inside that tell the story of the collection of the grain, right, which is pretty interesting. And so apparently from the hieroglyphics, the way that they did it, and there's actually pictures there, which is really neat to see, of these grain silos and people coming from all over the country with their bags of grain to dump it in during the 7 good years, and the collection that went on in preparation for the 7 bad years. So there's actually several sites all over Egypt that have pictures and that actually show people collecting grain. And so basically the way they did it is they built some big silo storehouse kind of thing, presumably of stone of some kind, and it had steps leading up to the top, and you just dumped it in from the top. And so what they had was an official from the city was at the foot of the steps with his tablet or parchment or whatever. He's got something in his hand that he's writing on. So it could have been parchment, probably parchment, not a tablet, I don't know. But anyways, he's got something in his hand that he's writing on, and he's recording how much the person in front of him has in his bag, right? Then the person with their bag walks up the stairs to the top of the silo, and there's another official up there, but this one is from Pharaoh. So in other words, Pharaoh's double checking to make sure that everything makes its way into the silo. So there's an official at the top of the stairs who's from Pharaoh. And then at the end of the day, they would compare their notes and make sure that what the guy at the bottom of the stairs says he collected is the same as what Pharaoh's official at the top of the stairs says was actually dumped in. And so there's a kind of a system of checks and balances there. And so they'd take it up to the top, they'd dump it in, and they would collect it, right? And then they also have, within many of the same pyramids, images and pictures drawn of the 7 years of famine. And in those, it shows people from all over. It's different there because in the first one, when they're collecting grain, most of the people there that are dumping the grain in the pictures are Egyptian. But in the 7 years of famine, you can see people from all kinds of countries are waiting in line with animals to trade for grain, different things, items. Some had people, slaves that they had brought that they wanted to trade. And so there's all kinds of things that people were bringing in during the 7 years of famine, trying to trade to get some kind of grain to take back, which is pretty neat. But the other neat thing that we learn from studying this is that Sosthenes I's vizier, who we believe was Joseph, right, also started not only to collect grain for 7 years, and we know it was 7 years because Amenemhat I died right at the end of the 7 good years, right? And so Sosthenes I, Amenemhat I lived for 10 years. For 3 years, Sosthenes took no vizier. So it was in his 3rd year that Joseph was promoted. And then 7 years later, Amenemhat I died, and that was the end of the 7 years of abundance. So he died right in that transition from abundance to the 7 years of famine. And so in all of that, in these 7 years of abundance, they began another project, which the Bible doesn't necessarily address, but I think it's pretty interesting, is that it says this same guy that was collecting for 7 years grain from all over the country, right? Totally fits the Bible story, right? 7 years, the vizier, number 2 over the whole land, who had just been promoted, collects grain for 7 years, and then to top it all off, because he's expecting, right, that something bad's going to happen at the end of the 7 years, which would be some kind of drought, right? I mean, if the crops fail, it's most likely because there was no water, right? So it would stand to reason that if God tells you there's going to be 7 years of famine, which means 7 years where the crops aren't growing, that could mean that there were 7 years where there was no water, right? And that's why everything's not growing. And so it would be smart then, if Joseph knows 7 years of famine are coming, to collect water somehow as well. And so And so Joseph, or this vizier that we know of Sostheres I, not only collected grain for 7 years, he dug a man-made lake, and it's massive, to collect water. And so, but the question is, how are they going to fill this lake? It must have been a massive project. And in fact, the interesting thing is this same lake that they dug by hand is where all of these pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, it's where their pyramids were placed, right? So they made this whole compound out of it. They put their pyramids there. They dug this massive lake. I mean, it's huge in scale. I mean, it's an actual deep, massive lake that they used as a water reservoir during the 7 years of famine. But in order to connect the lake with some kind of water, the Nile River is like, I want to say, I think 130 miles away or something like that from where they put this lake, right? And so basically what they did, 230 miles. And it wasn't probably if you just do a straight line on a map, it probably wasn't 230 miles, but following the topography and the ups and downs and everything, it was a 230-mile canal that they dug to connect the Nile River and this massive open pit that's going to become a lake that they dug, right? So they dig this huge man-made lake thing, and then they dig a 230-mile canal that connects the Nile River to this lake, right? And in some places, if it was like sloping down already, maybe they didn't dig it, and they would just let gravity take the water that way. But they guided it for 230 miles, digging where they needed to, in order to connect the Nile River and this man-made lake. And so the idea was that during these 7 years of abundance, while the Nile River was high, water would flow out of the Nile down this 230-mile canal and fill up the lake. And then in the 7 years of famine, as the Nile rivers were lower, right, thus causing the famine, they still then would have some of the water in the lake, and some of the water in the lake would run backwards then and help fill in the Nile a little bit to hopefully maybe give the farmers another year or so of having some water to kind of lessen the sting of the famine as much as possible. And then the lake itself became a reservoir for Pharaoh and his family and for everyone that was in that area. They could come to this lake that they dug and get fresh water. And so the interesting thing to me that is another confirmation that this is the biblical, the right time, biblically speaking, is that even today, the canal, this 230-mile canal that was dug by the number 2 guy in all of Egypt during that time, who was making preparations for 7 years for a disaster that was coming that they knew, and so he collected all of this grain, and he collected all of this water, and he dug this massive canal. And even today, the canal keeps the same name it had back then, and it's called, get this, the Joseph Canal, even today. And so, and he also dug. If you've ever heard of the Suez Canal, Joseph dug that one too. But then in later times, it got filled back in, and so it had to be redug again in modern times. So there's a modern Suez Canal. But the original Suez Canal, Joseph dug that one too, as a water reservoir during the biblical 7 years of abundance, making preparations for 7 years of famine, which makes sense. That if you're going to collect up food from all over the country, that you would also divert some water for that 7 years of famine as well. So anyways, so that's up until this point. You have Joseph is reigning, everything's doing good. Oh, and one other interesting thing is that the name of this place where the lake is Lake Moeris, Moeris. It is in the city called Hierapolis, right, or On. The neat thing about that is that because obviously Joseph would have been spending a lot of time there, because that's where this lake was that they dug. That's where they were doing a lot of the collecting of the grain. That's where the Joseph Canal was dug. So it would stand to reason that Joseph was spending a lot of time here in Hierapolis, right? Well, the neat thing is, if you go back in and look at the biblical story, the Bible says that during the 7 years of abundance, Joseph met a woman in Hierapolis who became his wife and the mother of Ephraim and Manasseh. And so it all fits together that Joseph found his wife there, because that's where he was. That's where all the construction was going on. That's where the pharaohs were building their pyramids now. That's where this man-made lake. It became the hub. And the Bible says that the priest of Hierapolis gave his daughter to Joseph to marry during those 7 years while they were doing all of this. So that's kind of interesting. All right. And then during Sostres I's reign, we know from Egyptian history then that at the end of the 7 years of abundance, that Amenemhet I dies. Right? And so it's just now Sostres I. And so they're about to move in and transition from the 7 years of abundance into the 7 years of famine. And so now Sostres I has no father, and he's leading all by himself, but Joseph is his aide, right? And it's interesting that in the first to second year, right around in there, when Jacob brings, they find out that Joseph is there, and Jacob brings the Israelites, all of Joseph's brothers, and the whole 70 of them, they all move in to Egypt. Joseph makes an interesting statement to Jacob when he tells him about what God has done. He says, God has promoted me. I'm number 2 over all of the land, and God has made me like a father now to Pharaoh. And so it's just kind of interesting that Amenemhet I had just died a year or two earlier, and so now Joseph is his number 2. The guy has no father, and it's kind of an interesting picture that adds a little weight then to what Joseph was saying, helps us to see what he means there. He says, I have now become like a father to this Pharaoh, in large part probably because his father had just died a year or two earlier, right? So that's kind of interesting. So this is the Pharaoh where Joseph reigned, did all of this stuff, and Egyptian history says that this Pharaoh's dynasty exploded. They were blessed beyond measure almost. I mean, it was just a fantastic explosion, one of the greatest explosions of wealth and growth in Egyptian history, and wouldn't you know it, it was because Joseph was running the show. A God-appointed man was running the show, because what happened was, at the end, the very last year, when everybody knows the 7-year famine is about to be over, they've eaten everything they have. And they know that the good times are about to come. They know it was a 7-year famine. It's been prophesied. Famine's about to be over. And so, but it's year 7, and they don't have anything left. So what does that mean? That means that they have nothing to plant with. Next year's going to be good, but there's no more seed left because they ate everything. I mean, it's been a famine for 7 years. They don't have any seeds just laying around anymore to plant for the first year of getting back to abundance again. And so everybody goes back to Pharaoh and to Joseph and says, hey, we know good times are about to come, but we don't have any seed. Let us sell you, let us become slaves to you in exchange for seed. Otherwise, the good times aren't going to mean anything to us. If we can't plant something now in this last year of famine, then we're not going to have anything for the first year of abundance coming out on the other side. So they said, let us become your slave. It's the only thing we have left. All of our stuff is gone. Let us become your slave. In exchange, give us seed, right? And so Joseph says, you know what? We're not going to take anybody into slavery. This is the deal, and we'll give you seed. Here's the deal I propose to you. When you get your harvest next year, because we know things are going to be back to normal next year, when you plant this seed and get your harvest, you owe Pharaoh 20%. And he did that with everyone from other countries too. So the whole, their whole region, their whole world, it'd be like, North America, Canada, and Mexico. So all of them are now paying taxes to our government, that kind of thing. And so from then on out, the 7 years of abundance, the 12th dynasty was exploding. Pharaoh's wealth was increasing because they had abundance. Then in the 7 years of famine, he was increasing because everybody sold them everything that they had to get the grain, so they exploded then. And then in the future, on the last year of the 7 years of famine, everyone agreed to give Pharaoh 20% of everything they had from then on out. And so all the rest of Sosthenes' reign, he's getting 20% of everyone from other countries, from all over the place. He's getting 20% of everything from then on out. So not only did he have 7 years of abundance where they exploded, in the 7 years of famine, they exploded even more because everyone in the whole country was giving them everything they had to get the grain. And so Pharaoh's just sitting back. He's got all this grain stored up, and he's just collecting. People are giving him everything they've got, and he's just handing them grain and becoming wealthier and wealthier, just taking everything that their world had. Everyone in their whole world that could walk to Egypt, that could ride in within a month or two's journey, was all giving everything they had now to Pharaoh. And then after that, after the 7 years of abundance, they had come into, the whole world came into this agreement where they'd give him 20%. And so this Sosthenes I, his reign exploded in a way like no other pharaoh ever had. It really set the course for Egyptian history, right? And it was all because of what God did through Joseph. And so what I want you to see, though, is that the whole world became slaves except for two people, two groups. The Bible says that Pharaoh excluded his priests, right? He was a worshiper of Ra, the sun god. So anyone that was one of his priests, he fed from his table, and so they didn't become slaves. You know, and not slaves as far as like they had no control over themselves. They were economic slaves almost, where they had to give their 20%. So the whole world was under that form of taxation, except for Pharaoh's priests and Joseph's family. So all the Israelites living in Egypt, right, were exempt from it. And so here God sets up this situation where all of Egypt is booming and blessed, and here are his people coming in. They're the only free ones in the whole country at this point. And that's the irony of ironies, is that when they started to fall away from the Lord, they were the only ones who were enslaved. But in the beginning, when everybody was following God and Joseph was serving the Lord and Jacob and his family were serving God and God's blessing was being poured out on them, the whole of Egypt, the whole known world there, was in this economic slavery to Pharaoh, but the Israelites were free. And they didn't have to pay it. And they were blessed, and they had the best of the land. They weren't even working for it. It was just given to them. And that is a picture of what God intended for them. But there's an interesting thing that begins to happen, and Ezekiel chapter 20 makes it plain. God gives Ezekiel a prophecy where he is to warn the Israelites of his day. And this is hundreds of years later in Ezekiel's time. He's to warn them in his day, and the example he is to use is the Israelites just after the time of Joseph, right? And so what he tells them is he says, during your time in Egypt, you fell into idolatry, and so God had to judge you by sending you into slavery. And so the idea is that basically what God is saying through Ezekiel is that the reason that the Israelites fell into slavery was not just that Pharaoh was evil and wicked, it was because they had fallen into idolatry while they were there. They were being blessed. They were the only ones who were free. Everything was going good, and in the midst of their prosperity, they turned their back on God and began to bring in all of these Egyptian gods and began to bring in this Egyptian culture. And God says, it even says in Ezekiel, God told him, I sent you several prophets while you were in Egypt trying to warn you. And the Bible says not a single man turned from his idolatry, and so God sent them into slavery to judge them for what they had done. And so in the midst of all of this blessing, everything's going good, you get Amenemhet II. And this is about the time when everything's still going good. God's warning them. He's being patient with them. They're beginning to multiply as a people, but yet they're bringing in Egyptian ideologies and Egyptian idolatry into their lifestyle, right? I won't go into it too much, but if you look in I believe it's Chronicles, where it's talking about some of the genealogies of Joshua's group, Ephraim, it talks about two who were killed in a battle in the Philistine country. But this is while they were all living in Egypt, right? If you follow the genealogy, it was just a couple people after Joseph, right? And so this was, right after Joseph's time, probably during Amenemhet II's time, that these two descendants of, ancestors of Joshua were killed in a battle in Philistine country. So what were they doing fighting in the Philistine country? Well, what we know is during this time, Amenemhet and then the next one after him, during their time, they would send bands of raiders. With the Egyptian army would send their army into these areas of the Philistines and other places. And so because the Israelites were free, they were joining in with the Egyptian army. They were joining in with all these other things. And so that's why some of these descendants of Joshua, ancestors of Joshua, were killed in Philistine country. Because they were free men. They were fighting in the Egyptian army, and that's what they were doing there. And so that's why, so if you go back in and read that story, it's kind of interesting. One other thing that I will point out, in case you don't get it in any of the other lessons, if I was to ask you when or what relation was Moses to Levi, right? Because this fits right into this time period. Joseph gets exalted to number 2. Jacob comes with Joseph's brothers and all of their sons and daughters, and there's 70 of them, the Bible says, and they all come in to the promised land, or to Egypt rather, out of the promised land into Egypt, and God says, it's there that I'm going to bless you. That's what he tells Jacob. Is he kind of comforts Jacob, because Jacob's worried. He's like, hey, I'm leaving the promised land to go to Egypt. That doesn't seem right. After everything I've heard from Abraham and Isaac, it doesn't seem right that I am taking everyone out of the promised land to go to Egypt. And God says, no, it's okay. I want you to go there because it's there that I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And so he brings all the brothers, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. Levi is the line that Moses and Aaron come from. And so it's kind of interesting to look at, because I guess the reason that I want to say this is because many people are wrong about the amount of time the Israelites spent in Egypt. Many people will say it was 400 years, 430 years, and that comes off of a misinterpretation of Exodus. I believe it's Exodus 12:4, or 12:6, somewhere in there. It says that the Israelites, and this is the most common translations today read it this way. It says the Israelites were in Egypt 400 or 430 years. Most of them say 400 years, right? But the trouble is, the original text there, and it's copied correctly into the Septuagint and everything. I don't know why modern scholars leave it out. I guess they think it's wrong, so they're leaving it out. But it's not wrong. What the original text says is that the Israelites were in Egypt and sojourners in the Promised Land a total of 400 years. And then that fits, because Paul says, when Paul is talking about it in Galatians, he says that Abraham, it was 430 years after Abraham got the promise that the Israelites were set free. And so Paul clearly says in Galatians that it was the 430 years was from the time that Abraham got the promise from God to the time of the Exodus. So you have to subtract out of that 430 years the end of the life of Abraham, all of the life of Isaac, and a good part of the life of Jacob. What you're left with is about 210 years that the Israelites were actually in Egypt, right? So if the 430 years was from the time that God spoke it to Abraham to the time that Moses leaves, and then you subtract out the end of the life of Abraham and the life of Isaac and all of that to the time when Jacob brings the 70 in, there's only 210 years left, right? That they were in Egypt only 210 years, right? And then from that, out of that 210 years, all of it wasn't slavery. There was a big part of the time that they were in Egypt, the whole life of Joseph. Joseph was, I believe, 30 when he was exalted, and he was 110 when he died. So that's 80 years of the time in Egypt was spent in blessing and prosperity. So you have to subtract that 80 years from the 210, which leaves only 130 years left, and they weren't put into slavery right away. So at a maximum, they were only slaves for 130 years. right? Because they were only in Egypt 210. It was 430 years total from the time God gave Abraham the promise to the time Moses brought the people out. 210 years was how long they were in Egypt. 80 years of that was blessing and prosperity because Joseph was alive, right? And then the slavery came later. So at a maximum, they were only slaves about 130 years, right? Which then begins to say, well, that's why I asked you about Moses. If they were only in Egypt 210 years, how close was Moses? If you go back into Levi's age, because we're only talking about 200 years here. It's interesting. If you go back in and look at the genealogy and follow it carefully of Levi, both Moses' mother, Jochebed, and his father, were both descendant from Levi, right? But if you look at it, on his father's side, right, Moses is Levi's great-grandson. And if you look at it on the mother's side, Moses is Levi's grandson. Jochebed, if you go back in and look, is Levi's daughter. If you go back in and read it, and it says, basically it says that Levi's son, and it gives his name, and then when it's talking about Moses' mother, it says that was his sister, right? So if Levi's son, right, his sister was Jochebed, which is just another way of saying that it was Levi's daughter, most likely. I mean, there could have been a stepmother involved somewhere along the way, but the idea is that Levi's son, his sister, is Jochebed, right? And so even if you follow it through that line, the other line, Levi's son's line, Moses at the most is a great-grandson. And if you follow it through Jochebed's side, Moses is a grandson of Levi, which fits with the fact that they were only in Egypt 200 years, right? And Moses was 80 when they left. So if they're only in Egypt 210 years, and Moses was 80 when they left, there's only a small window of time in there between Levi and Moses, right? So anyway, in that fits. If you go back in and read the genealogy, Moses was the great-grandson of Levi, which doesn't fit at all if there's a 400-year gap. But when you realize they were only in Egypt 210 years, and Moses was born right in the middle of that, right? Because he was 80 when they left, right? So there's only 100 and something years from the time Jacob brings them in. It was only a little over 100 years before Moses was born, which makes sense because he was great-grandson on one side and grandson on the other. All right. So Menahem II, everything's booming. Sostres II is born. Now Joseph is an old man at this point, right? Joseph is older, probably not a full-time vizier at this point, probably retired. Somebody else has taken over the position. He's maybe some kind of an official, but everybody is still protected. The Israelites are booming. They've fallen probably at this point into severe idolatry. Their numbers are growing larger. And so Sostres II, though, knew Joseph. He didn't do anything to the Israelites. Everything's still good during this time. Then you get to Sostres III. And Sostres III he didn't know Joseph, because Joseph died in the 5th year of Sostres II. So right in the beginning of Sostres II's reign, Joseph died. So he knew him, didn't do anything to the Israelites. He knew that his father loved him and all of that, so didn't do anything to him, to the Israelites. But his son now, Sostres III, never knew Joseph. And so he's looking at how the Israelites are booming. And so we have an Egyptian document from Sostres III's main general. And in it he talks about some of the things he did. And he says, but above it all, the thing that Pharaoh, he calls him Pharaoh, but it's Sostres III, the thing that Pharaoh loves about me the most is that I was able to put all the Asiatics into slavery. Now, Asiatics Asiatics living in Egypt. He says, all the Asiatics living in Egypt I was able to put into slavery. You have to understand, Asiatic is their word for the Israelites, because they came from the Promised Land, which is what they called Asia, right? And so they all came from the Promised Land and entered into Egypt, and so they're Egyptians, but in their midst were all these, what they called Asiatics, which is why you don't find many references to Israel in Egypt, because they didn't call them Israel. Their word for all these people that had come out of the Promised Land were Asiatics. And that goes all the way back even to the time of Abraham, which I won't get into that too much. But we have Egyptian documents from the time of Abraham and those pharaohs, and they realized that during famine and all this stuff, that people from the Promised Land, what we call the Promised Land, they called it Asiatics, would come down in to Egypt with all their herds, and they'd start taking the good land and all this kind of stuff, and it was frustrating the Egyptians. So the Egyptians in Abraham's day started passing laws that forbid shepherds to bring their flocks down into the good land of Egypt, which is why Joseph, when he's talking to them, says to his brothers, you better make sure you tell Pharaoh that you're a shepherd, because they hate shepherds here, right? You better tell him that you are, right? Because we've got grace right now, because I'm number 2, and you need to make sure that you let Pharaoh know what you do, because otherwise they're not going to let you in with all your herds. They have laws against it. That's what he's saying, because during the time of Abraham and every famine, every time there's heartache, all these Asiatics would rush in and start taking up the good land. Their herds would eat everything, and they didn't care for these people anyways, and so they set up all these laws and regulations that forbid people from bringing their herds into the good land there in Egypt. So Joseph says, listen, before you go, you better make sure you tell Pharaoh what you're doing, who you are, because shepherds are detestable to Egyptians. In other words, the only way you're getting in with your flocks is if Pharaoh says it's okay. Right? That's what he means there. He's saying you better make sure you tell Pharaoh who you are and what you do, because shepherds are abominable to these people. You can't just show up with your flocks. If Pharaoh says you can go, then it's fine. So while you're talking with Pharaoh, tell him what you do, and then Pharaoh gave them then permission to take all of their flocks into the good land, right? So Sostres III now has got all these Asiatics living in there, and so his general on some of his writings said that what Sostres III loved the most about him was that he was the one who enslaved all of the he calls them Asiatics, but it was the Israelites, right? People that had come in from the Promised Land, and so they put them into slavery under Sostres III. Right? Sostres III was also the pharaoh who tried to have all the babies killed. Right, so he enslaves all the Israelites. He doesn't know Joseph. He enslaves the Israelites, tries to have all their babies killed, and it was his daughter who found Moses. Right? And so his daughter finds Moses, and Moses is raised in Sostres III's house. So the very one who wants to have them all killed, the very one who put them in slavery, in his house grows up this Hebrew boy. Right? And then as Moses gets older, Jewish history, not biblical history. Biblical history is silent on this time of Moses' life, but Jewish history says that Moses was a general for Sostres III. Right? That while Sostres III was alive, Moses grew up in his house, and Moses was promoted to be a general. And in fact, Moses had just come back, according to Jewish history, from a major victory. And so when he killed that Egyptian, he had just gotten back in and started seeing his people, and he's upset with how his people are being treated, and so he takes matters, as a fighting man who just came back from battle, takes matters into his own hands and kills the Egyptian. I think this is interesting because when God commissions Moses, he tells him to go talk to Pharaoh, and he says, hey, I'm not a man of words. And he says, I can't do it. And he gets all nervous and tries to back out when God tells him to go speak to Pharaoh. But if you'll notice, Moses led the Israelites in battles against Amalek and the Amalekites. He led the Israelites in battles against all the Amorites of Og and Bashan, all that area, and he took over all those things. He led the Israelites in all sorts of battles and war, all kinds of stuff before they got into the Promised Land. Anything that happened outside the Promised Land, Moses was the one that led them into those battles. And never once did Moses say, I don't think I can lead an army. He never once gave God any. He said, "Oh, okay, you want me to lead them into battle? That's fine." Never do we get anything in the Bible where Moses backed away from the command to take them to war. He backs away though when God gives him something to speak about. So it very well could be true, that Jewish history, that Moses was a general, that he had plenty of experience leading people into battle. And so Sostres III, though, has a son who grows up at the same time as Moses in the same house, and his name is Amenehet III. And so Moses comes back, Sostres is gone now, Amenehet III is leading. Moses comes back from battle. Sostres III is dead. His son, who grew up at the same time as Moses, is now in charge. Moses kills the Egyptian, and Amenehet III looks at him and he says, "You know what? I got to kill this Moses guy. He's a Hebrew. He's about my same age. He's a general. Obviously, he's not loyal to me or to the Egyptians because he just tried to kill an Egyptian." And so Sostres III's son, Amenehet III, is the one who tries to have Moses killed. And we know from Egyptian records that he reigned for 40 years. And we know that Moses killed the Egyptian right when Amenehet III had just taken over. He hadn't been Pharaoh very long. And Moses comes back, kills this Egyptian. Amenehet III finds out about it, and he realizes, hey, probably, who knows, there might have been jealousy growing up anyways, that here Amenehet III is the heir of the Pharaoh's throne, but here Moses is a famous general. Also grew up in the same house, but he's not Egyptian. He's not really part of the family. He was adopted, and so there could have been some jealousy all the way going through. So either way, this is the Pharaoh that tries to have Moses killed after he attacks the Egyptian. Egyptian records tell us he reigned for 40 years, right? Which fits, 40-something, which fits because then 40 years later, God says, the Pharaoh who wanted to kill you, because Moses was in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses was 40 when he killed the Egyptian. 40 years later, God says, the Pharaoh who tried to kill you is dead now. And we know from Egyptian history that Amenehet III reigned for about 40 years, which is interesting. And so he's dead now, and his son, a young man, takes over, named Amenehet IV. Right? Not super young, but definitely nothing like his father, so he's not like a teenager or anything, but probably in his 30s, takes over. And this is the one who Moses has to go back to and deal with the plagues. And so this is the Pharaoh that wouldn't listen to Moses, right? Brash, younger, not wanting to hear it, just has taken the throne within the last 2 years. Right, because his dad reigned for almost 40 years. So he's just now taken the throne. He's probably got an ego. He's probably very prideful, probably trying to prove himself because he just took the throne. When Moses returns and says, hey, you got to let these people go, this Pharaoh has just taken over. Right? And so he's probably thinking, hey, this guy's trying to get over on me. He knows I just now took the throne. He's trying to see if he can get these people out because I just now took over. So whatever it was, he's prideful and he's not wanting to let him go. Maybe he's thinking, hey, I have to prove myself. I'm a new Pharaoh. I can't let these people walk all over me. Whatever it is, he was the Pharaoh, though. And so his son, which we never hear of, was the one that was killed in the Passover, right? But Amenehet IV is the one who was drowned in the Red Sea. And so, interestingly enough, the Pharaoh after Amenehet IV, according to Egyptian records, was his wife. For some reason, his wife took over. Well, we know the reason from the Bible is because he drowned in the Red Sea. And so there was absolute anarchy, right, during this period. In fact, there's some letters that are out there that talk about someone wrote them who was just a member of Egypt's community during this time of the anarchy. And it's kind of interesting the thing he says. He says, the man who poured water out on the ground, which is what Moses did when he came in. He says, the man that poured water out on the ground lured our Pharaoh out of his hole like a snake coming out of his hole and killed him by the rushing on of water, right? By the pouring on of water, he killed him, which is exactly what happened to Pharaoh. That the man who showed up, who poured water out on the ground, which is what Moses did when he first showed up, turned water into blood in front of Pharaoh. He says, the man who showed up and poured water out onto the ground lured Pharaoh out of his home like a snake out of his hole and killed him by the pouring on of water. And he says, and now slaves have left, and slave women are wearing fine jewels, and they left, and he says, in their wake now all of these wealthy women are like slaves themselves, because think about it, all of these wealthy women, their husbands just drowned in the Red Sea, and so now they have nothing left. And he talks about how there was no one left to protect their homes, and so the poor people of Egypt, the whole army's dead. All these wealthy people have left their homes abandoned with just their women and children in it, and so all kinds of poor men just threw these ladies out and took the nice houses, right? And so there was anarchy. You know, if you're a poor person, you have nothing, and you don't have any morals, and there's this wealthy house there, and all the men that were in the house are gone now, and all you got to do is kick the women out. That was happening all over Egypt. And so you had all these displaced women who were, at one point he says, there's all the women who were of royal stature are now sleeping out on the ground and stuff like that he talks about. And he talks about the slaves who left with great amounts of jewels. You know, the slaves were adorned in jewels and fine jewelry as they left. All this, and it all fits with what the Bible said. But the neat thing is that it was to think about that sometimes we don't get the picture of this in our mind, because the Bible then shifts to talking about the Israelites in the wilderness and doesn't go back and talk about what happened in Egypt. Sometimes we miss the fact that there would have been great anarchy. There's no Pharaoh. There's no army. All the officials are dead. They're all gone. It's just the capital is empty. And on top of that, 2.5 million slaves just left the capital. So not only is Pharaoh and all the officials of the capital dead in the Red Sea, the whole Egyptian army is dead in the Red Sea, and 2 to 3 million or so slaves of the Hebrews and all these other people are now gone too. It was like a ghost town. The capital had become a ghost town. And so it was just anarchy. And so Pharaoh's wife takes over, but she's fearful for her life because there's no army there. They had a second army in southern Egypt to protect that border. She flees down to the southern army to take protection there. But the general of the southern army, who was kind of like a cousin of theirs, within about 2 years, he just killed her and took over. Or something happened to her. She disappeared somehow. And he becomes a new pharaoh. But he's not a blood relative of theirs per se. And so it starts a new dynasty. And the 12th dynasty is now over when Pharaoh's wife was killed a couple years later. And this general from the southern army takes over, and that becomes the 13th dynasty. And but he doesn't have the strength in the army to keep all of it, and so the Libyans came in and they took over a big part of Egypt, and they became the 14th dynasty. And then a group of Arabs called the Hyksos came in and they took over another part of Egypt and became the 16th dynasty. They have that actually backwards. The first one that came in is what we call today the 16th dynasty. And then a second group of Arabs came in, they were also Hyksos, and they took over a different part of Egypt, and they became the 15th dynasty. And those dynasties reigned for the next 200 years. They had almost 200 pharaohs between the four dynasties over the next 200 years. Just about every other year, a pharaoh was being assassinated, killed. It was just total anarchy in Egypt for 200 years after the army was drowned in the Red Sea. So for 200 years, it was anarchy. Pharaohs dying left and right, people being assassinated. One dynasty in that 200-year period had 70-something pharaohs. If you compare the 200 years that Israel was in Egypt, there was only 7 pharaohs because God's blessing was on them most of that time. There was 7 pharaohs as compared to 70 in the 200 years after, in the wake of this destruction from the plagues to the destruction of the army. I mean, Egypt was devastated, and they went into a 200-year anarchy period where the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th dynasties were all reigning. Basically, this great empire that had been built up under God's blessing was now divided by when these different raiding groups came in and took their chunk, and these 4 dynasties reigned at the same time. Okay? Alright, so I know this has been a long video, so I'm going to close it down, but that is the story of Israel's time in Egypt.